Happy Monday, everybody. Every Monday I go over my best of one, best of three meta review for Standard. And we're in week 6 of Bloomburrow. And so a lot of the archetypes have been kind of figured out, at least for Tier 1. Top 3 have been kind of the same top 3 for a while now. So I'm going to try to get through these relatively quickly, partially because the 49ers are about to play and I'd like to see kickoff. So first up here, we've got Mono Red Aggro. So what I do is I use a third-party tracker called Untapped. This way I can kind of remove my bias for which is the best deck in best of one. That being said, there are many decks that can climb to Mythic and are competitive, and best of one is its own special meta because of the best of one hand smoother in Arena, which basically does a hidden mulligan. And for the first, it does a hidden mulligan that you don't really see that allows you to run a lower amount of lands and really affects the lands 1, 2, and 3. It doesn't affect 4, 5, and 6 as much, which is why Control you'll still see running the typical amount of lands. But for what it does is it ends up favoring aggro a little bit, so best of one tends to be dominated by Mono Red. And that's what we're seeing here. Number 1, we've got Mono Red Aggro. And the other thing that I like to do is I like to go throughout the weeks, I like to talk about how the deck is changing according to the tracker. And so this is the top performing deck for bronze to mythic, not a specific archetype or rank, not a specific meta to a specific rank within the best of one ladder. And this week, what we see, if we compare it to week 3, we do finally see some changes to this list. So we've got a one more copy of the Manifold Mouse and 4 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire, which is the +2/+2 and destroy an artifact, and 1 additional copy of the Demonic Ruckus. And to make room for this, we're dropping the Lightning Strike down by 2 and bringing out all 4 copies of the Rockface Village. So I really do like this. Like, if you're going to bring the Rockface Villages in, treat them as a combat trick instead of the base land count. So 18 is a pretty good one for this really low curve in best of one. And then the Rockface Villages are the ones that can tap for 1 and a red and tap the land to give a mouse or lizard or whatever +1/+0 in haste. So it's a way to trigger your Valiant repeatedly, right? And it's kind of annoying when you have a whole bunch of Rockface Villages in your hand and then a bunch of your tricks that you want to cast that you're not able to with the red mana. So there's a little bit of like give and take there. It kind of helps extend a little bit further into the late game. The lightning strikes also are kind of like for the direct damage, give you a little bit more reach, but a little bit, hurt the decks a little bit on the, if you have like a handful of lightning strikes, you're not going to be able to get that turn 3 win, right? Because you need some of the repeatable damage of the threats. So the whole point of this deck is win by turn 3 or turn 4. You've got the mouse synergies, Emberheart Challenger, Heartfire Hero, Manifold Mouse. I feel like I've talked about this archetype so much that I hope you all understand it by now. It's good against decks that lack interaction like the Boros Convoke and Selesnya Rabbits that are going wide. It's weaker to decks that are running like Get Lost, Lightning Helix, Go for the Throat, Cut Down, any form of that single point interaction that can destroy your Double Striker or your Slick Shot Show Off. And so that's number 1. Number 2 is Rakdos Aggro, and it is a very similar counterpart to it. I'm seeing a lot of the same cards in this strategy, but adding in black for the Callous Sellsword. Now, you do not need black because the important part of this is Burn Together, right? So you can play this without bringing in the Blackcleave Cliffs and the Sulphurous Springs if you don't have the rares to craft. Really what you're doing is you're bringing the Fling in here through the Burn Together adventure to be able to get a turn 3 more consistently. You can do this through several routes. One is plotting Slickshot Show Off on turn 2, and then turn 3 playing 2 combat tricks that increase the power by at least 2, making this power go up to 9, and then 11 when you fling it with the Callous Sellsword adds up to 20 damage on turn 3. The other way that you can hit turn 3 is through either the Heartfire Hero or the Cacophony Scamp, hitting for triple damage. So if this gets damage through and then you fling it afterwards, both of these deal their damage in addition to the damage that you get off of the fling. So the downside with this is you don't have the shocks and you don't have the lightning strikes, so you have worse interaction if you come up against the same deck in the mirror match, and but you have a more consistent turn 3. And there's a slight variation on the matchups of between mono red and Rakdos Aggro. Some decks are good against mono red, but not against Rakdos Aggro, and vice versa. But for the most part, the general strategy is the same. They're both weak to the single point interaction and demand that there's enough single point interaction in the meta. And this list was the one that I covered at the beginning of the season that hit Mythic in 4.5 hours. You can really churn through games if that's your jam. Sorry, I'm just going to have to patch this one in really quick because I forgot to mention it. The changes this week we saw from last week are that we dropped 2 copies of the Dreadmaw's Ire. So the combat trick that they're bringing in mono red, taking it out of this version, and instead leaning more heavily into the Demonic Ruckus to be able to get around the go wide strategies. And also tweaking the lands a little bit, dropping 4 mountains and a Sulphurous Springs to bring in the 4 copies of the Blackcleave Cliffs. Third on the list is Selesnya Rabbits, and those are kind of the top 3. After that, we kind of get into tier 2, and we see more of a rotation of the tier 2 decks, kind of competing for the top 4, 4 through 8. Selesnya Rabbits is the go wide strategy that struggles against mono red aggro and Rakdos Aggro, but then punishes the decks that are running the single point interaction to counter the mono red aggro and the Rakdos Aggro, like mono black, right? The Lightning Helix, Get Lost, anything that's relying on the single point interaction struggles against this deck because of cards being multiple rectangles in one card. So like Hop to It, getting 3 tokens, Sanguine Evangelist coming in with multiple, the Offspring off of Pop Patch Recruit, all demands that your opponent uses more than 1 removal per card that you're playing. And it, on the other hand, is weak to the wraths of like Temporary Lockdown and Sunfall, anything of that Deadly Cover-Up that is affecting, that sweeps the board. It does have the ability to refuel off of the Knight Errant of Eos, and the general plan with this is you're just bunny synergies. Phineas is going to be able to give everything +1/+1. You've got the Valley Mite Caller that gets +1/+1 every time a rabbit, squirrel, raccoon, etc. come into the graveyard. So with like or into the battlefield, sorry. So Hop to It then makes it into like a 4/4 on turn 3, and you can hit for an incredible amount of pressure. The Pop Hatch Recruit further hates on that single point interaction and makes it so that you get a +1/+1 counter if your opponent is using removal on your bunnies. And you kind of have Season of the Bro is really the one like top end just like a nod to a little bit of top end in this archetype. As far as the changes to the archetype go, oh shoot, I think I forgot while I was rambling to talk about what happened in Rakdos. I'm going to have to like patch that in real quick. Okay, so Selesnya Rabbits basically brought in an additional copy of Phineas, Ace Archer, and then undid the lands that we were seeing in week 5, going back to favoring the rare lands instead of the uncommons. So we're dropping the Blossoming Sands and the Cryosite Heath, which are both good budget options if you don't have the rares. And instead is bringing in the 3 copies of the Brushland and 4 copies of the Razorverge Thicket. So with the rare lands, you can shave a land. Without the rare lands, then you should probably be running 1 more land and not the Phineas. And that will be number 3. Fourth on the list is Jund Aggro, and this is another like prowess deck. This one not running the Slickshot Show Off, but still leaning kind of into the Heartfire Hero, Cacophony Scamp, and Callous Sellsword that we see in Rakdos. The upside to bringing it in the green is that we get the Questing Druid for a little bit of dig so that we can go a little bit longer if they do have the single point interaction. And then we also have the protection spells of Overprotect and Snakeskin Veil. This one's not running the Snakeskin Veil, leaning on the Overprotect instead. But Giant Growth and the Overprotect allow you to hit for that triple damage off of the Cacophony Scamp Heartfire Hero better. And then we also have the Picnic Ruiner, which has the double strike. So it's just kind of an alternative path that's a little bit stronger against the single point interaction that people bring in to counter Rakdos Aggro. You're going to see Gruul Aggro or variations of Gruul Aggro more commonly in best of 3 because you need to have some sort of plan when they bring in all of those cut downs and go for the throats from the sideboard. You need to have some sort of answer to that. In best of one, you don't. So this one tends to be a little bit worse than the Rakdos Aggro deck. Just it's a little bit slower to not be running the Slickshot Show Off. I think it's just really like it lowers the turn 3 consistency just a little bit in comparison to Rakdos, and then it's a very similar plan, right? But yeah, you've got like the Audacity, which gives you the recurring double strike on the Picnic Ruiner. You also get the card draw if somebody does have the single point interaction to remove it, which then helps it extend a little bit later than the Rakdos Aggro. So there's a little bit of pros and cons there. Number 5 is Boros Mice, and this one has really great matchups outside of Mono Red and Rakdos Prowess. So if you are not bumping into the first 2 decks, the Boros Mice is relatively well positioned in the meta. It does a similar thing that what Mono Red is doing. It does have the Manifold Mouse, Emberheart Challenger, Heartfire Hero combo that is all over best of 1 right now, and instead, you know, you're bringing in white, which decreases the consistency a little bit, but not too bad as long as you have the right fixing for it. And then you've the white basically increasing the amount of times that you can trigger Valiant on your Heartfire Hero. And and the Might of the Meek gives you a little bit better synergies when you have the Mouse tribal deck. All right, and number 6 is the 4-color Reanimator deck, and this is very similar to the list that I was that I showcased on Saturday that won the community vote. And instead of going, it has an alternative top end, but the strategy still applies, right? So the crux of the deck, the core of the deck, is Squirming Emergence, being able to use this to get a permanent that's equal to the amount of permanents in your graveyard onto the battlefield. So you're trying to mill something like an Atraxa, and you can get like a turn 3 Atraxa with this combo, right? Or maybe a turn 4. And you're setting up the mill through the Founding of the Third Path. This does allow you to cast the adventure side of the Picklock Prankster for free on chapter 1. Then chapter 2 it also mills, and then on the third chapter is when you can then play a instant or sorcery from your graveyard for free, allowing you to play the Squirming Emergence even if you don't have it in your hand. You just have to mill it into your graveyard. The rest of it is all in here to just kind of help us get that combo started, right? So and then other alternative ways to kind of cheese things. So we've got Jace to like do the self mill. Whale of the Forgotten can get something like the Founding of the Third Path back from your graveyard to your hand to replay it before it goes to the graveyard. Sorry, I think I misspoke. From the battlefield to your hand, and then you can also use it for digging into your combo pieces. Atraxa is like one of the key things that we're looking to reanimate in this. The list that I was running 1 Atraxa, and then like the big green threat that gains 4 life and draws a card that then turns into a copy that I'm blanking on the name of, but you can look at that video for alternative threats. Lumra here kind of triggers the self mill thing and then is equal to the amount of lands that you have in play, so it can also just be a very large threat that also helps you dig for additional stuff that you can reanimate. Cruelty of Gix gives you a reanimation target. Harvester of Misery, I'm not super sold on this card, honestly. It was in both this list and in the previous one. The upside is that you can discard it and then have it be a reanimation target that can then wipe the board again. So it's a nice tool against Rakdos Lizards, where Lizards kind of struggles with the -2/-2. Beza is a nice little stabilizing threat here, stabilizing force against aggro. And Heaped Harvest and Spelunking help you ramp, because you don't necessarily have to cheese things, right? You can cheese things at the beginning, and sometimes that's not enough to win the game. And then it's nice to be able to actually play into your later threats. So a little bit of ramp thrown in there. And then we have the Cut Down and the 4 Bitter Triumphs, which I think the upside to this list over the list that I showcased on Saturday is this has more interaction for the mono red. But I do think like the Cruel Somnophage was kind of cool that you could do that off of the Founding the Third Path. So I don't think this archetype is figured out yet. I think that there's definitely room to play and bring in some alternative things. This one does seem more heavily teched though against mono red. Philology Archaeologist helps enable the mill while also creating a body that can block the early pressure of the aggro decks. So I like some of the inclusions, little less sold on some of the other ones, right? Into the Floodmaw as well is in here to increase the help us out with mono red. So typically what we see in the meta breakers that I talk about on Sunday and that I do for my gameplay videos is that some of them are more inspired by best of 3, and then people are playing the best of 3 deck in best of 1, and this one is more geared specifically to a mono red heavy meta. So it really depends on what you're experiencing on the ladder, but this helps kind of hedge against the mono red and Rakdos Aggro. I hope that makes sense. Number 7 is Boros Convoke, and this one, if we compare it to week 3, has undergone no changes. Oh, I also forgot to mention for Boros Mice, there were also no changes. So some of the archetypes are figured out, and Boros Convoke especially hasn't really seen that much change, right? So Voldaren Epicure rotated out at the beginning of August, and we got the Hop to It to replace it, which works really well to an extent. I mean, the Yotian Frontliner has to be brought in so that we have another early artifact target for the Gleeful Demolition, but it does pair nicely with the Case of the Gateway Express to just up that creature count and then get in for that aggression. We don't really see the War Leader's Call being played in this list, which you'll see sometimes in best of 3, because it's better against the mid-range and the control matchups. Instead, we're running the Sanguine Evangelist to just maximize the board presence. And I had somebody ask me why it's called Boros Convoke. I guess people are moving towards calling it Boros Aggro because the only Convoke card is Knight Errant of Eos. But the whole strategy of this deck is to get the Knight Errant of Eos out on turn 2, and then find an Imidane's Recruiter and swing on turn 3. That is the ideal situation. It actually almost plays more like a combo deck, which is why I don't agree with Boros Convoke or Boros Aggro necessarily. I'm going to keep calling it the Boros Convoke matchup. But this one's similar to the Selesnya Rabbits, can struggle a little bit against the mono red and the Rakdos Aggro because it doesn't have that early interaction, but it punishes the decks that do because of the go wide strategy. And then number 8 here is Gruul Aggro, and this one not bringing in the black, but basically being the same deck, running the Snakeskin Veils instead of the Overprotect because you don't have the triple damage fling combo. You can more cheaply keep this up to protect yourself from single point interaction. And then you've got the Slickshot Show Off, the Emberheart Challenger, the Manifold Mouse, the Heartfire Hero, and just kind of like the core red, right? A lot of what I've already talked about. Combat tricks with like the Monstrous Rage, Shock, and not running the Lightning Strike, so to kind of make room for the protection and the inconsistencies of the bringing in the green, you kind of are leaving out a little bit of the reach, but then giving yourself a little bit better mid-range threats by the dig off of Questing Druid, as well as the +1/+1 that triggers Valiant very well of Innkeeper's Talent. So an alternative strategy, and I've really liked playing the Gruul Aggro. This one has the Voldaren Thrillseeker, and you're able to sacrifice a creature. Kind of gives you an alternative to the Lightning Strike while also being a body. And if we compare this one to last week, there are still no changes to this archetype as well. And now for best of 3. And so what I like to do with best of 3 is I like to look at the Standard Challenge tournament on Magic the Gathering Online. It is a very competitive, high-end tournament. We see lots of really great players there, like Mogged, every week. Rim F, you start to get familiar with the names if you've been doing this long enough. And the nice thing about best of 3 is that it is not dominated by mono red aggro. So if you are tired of the coin flipping experience that best of 1 can be, I highly recommend checking out best of 3. It does not have the hand smoother, so you will start with a 0 land hand or a 7 land hand quite a bit more often than you do in best of 1. And with that means that aggro is toned down a little bit, and we see alternative strategies. Particularly Domain has been flirting around in the top for the last couple of weeks, and we see a first place on Saturday. I'm going to skip Friday just because 3 tournaments is enough to cover already. But that being said, Friday was dominated by Dimir Midrange and Orzhov Midrange, which we're already going to cover through Saturday and Sunday's tournaments. So Domain, if we compare it to week 3, which is the last time that I talked about this, we can see that they dropped 1 temporary lockdown to bring in a Nissa Ascended Animist. And this just is like less board flood presence and more problematic blockers that we needed to then get the overrun effect through, as well as more artifact and enchantment hate being relevant, which we'll see throughout several of the archetypes this week. more of that, specifically artifact hate becoming more popular to bring in. And as far as lands go, we dropped a Cavern of Souls and brought in a Brushland. And for the best of 3 sideboard, we've got, we dropped the 1 Obstinate Baloth. So this one has been really punishing the Lilianas in the meta in Golgari midrange. The Golgari that's doing the Vraska 1-turn kill can kind of still get away with playing Liliana because of being able to immediately ultimate off of the talent combo. But there are Lilianas in other archetypes like Orzhov Midrange and things like that, then the Obstinate Baloth is good for countering. We're also dropping 1 copy of the Tranquil Frillback, and this one giving you some artifact and enchantment hate, graveyard hate, and life stabilization against the early aggression. And then we've got 3 copies of Beza, the Bounding Spring. So part of the reason why we're dropping the Tranquil Frillback is because we're bringing in the artifact and enchantment hate already from Nissa, and then we've got the stabilization that gives us a little bit more mid-range value than the Tranquil Frillback does with the Beza Bounding Spring. And we also see a change, alternative strategy, maybe less aggro coming at the expected in this tournament, because they also dropped the 3 copies of the Elspeth Smite. And if you're going to run Domain in best of 1, I would recommend bringing in the Elspeth Smite, because that's kind of your answer to the mono red aggro and Gruul Aggro, any of the early aggression. And we've moved Nissa from the sideboard to the main, and we've also brought in a Disdainful Stroke, and we've also brought in a Negate, which helps out against the other Domain matchups and other control matchups. And then the Temporary Lockdown, we didn't get rid of the other copy, we just moved it to the sideboard. I like this. Starting out with 2 in the deck makes it so that if you are up against a non-board-centric strategy like other Domain decks, you can then sideboard out of it, and you don't have to have as many in your starting, right? It's going to make you a little bit worse sometimes, though, against that like game 1 against an early deck. So it depends on how much you're anticipating there being the Rakdos Lizards, Gruul Aggro, that sort of thing in your tournament scene. And speaking about Rakdos Lizards, 2nd place on Saturday was taken down by Tichuco. I don't think I actually mentioned who took it down with Domain. Sorry, Sandeutsch. So 2nd place was taken down by Rakdos Lizards, and if we compare this to last week, we can see that they brought in a additional copy of the Thoughtstalker Warlock. And this deck struggles a little bit like mono red in best of 1 against early interaction. So being able to use the Thoughtstalker Warlock to remove board wipes and things that are going to destroy your wonderful lizards like Gev, Thoughtstalker Warlock can kind of help you out in that situation, which is why we also brought in the Deep Cavern Bat. We're bringing in 1 copy of the Flame Caller. The amount of damage that this can end up doing on turn 3 is quite impressive, because it changes all of the pings to 2 damage instead of 1, and we're also dropping the 2 copies of Scales of Shale, and that one was better, I think, in the mirror match, really, where if you're just trading blows with your other lizard opponent, then having the Scales of Shale tip it with the lifelink can be really helpful if you're not blocking terribly well, because all of these like low toughness creatures, I guess these have more toughness than power, but like still, there's not like a 3 toughness creature in there's not a very great body, right, for blocking, right? So you're usually attacking, your opponent's letting it through, they're attacking back and forth, where the Scales of Shale then comes in handy. And we've dropped 1 mountain to bring in 1, we dropped 1 swamp to bring in 1 mountain to reflect the changes in dropping the Scales of Shale for the Valley Flame Caller. So the best of 3 sideboard is dropping the 2 copies of the Thoughtstalker Warlock. So one went to the main, the other one got dropped. Getting rid of a Bitter Triumph, a Duress, and an Urbrask's Forge. So Duress is good against the control matchups, similar to the Thoughtstalker Warlock. Deep Cavern Bat can kind of get rid of the interaction in your opponent's hand. And the Urbrask's Forge is a nice way to play against midrange or control. Since we're seeing more artifact hate being brought in to answer the Urbrask's Forge, I think dropping it down to 3 makes a lot of sense. And we're bringing in some of our own artifact hate. So if we're coming up against the mirror match where you expect them to bring in Urbrask's Forge and a bunch of removal, you can then play a Braid, works pretty nicely. And also if you come up against another problematic artifact in a different archetype, And then we also have the Cut Down and the Long Goodbye. And I think that one really points to maybe expecting more Rakdos Lizards in the standard challenge tournament scene. Just because, like I mentioned, it does well to have more interaction in the mirror match. And then we have 3 copies of Scales of Shale in the sideboard. Again, you'd be bringing that in. This is less good in the matchups where you don't have a board. So if you're playing up against control, you don't want to bring in the Scales of Shale. It does give your creature indestructible, so I guess you can use it in response to removal. But depending on the player, right, like it can be tricky to actually play it correctly, and you get this cat and mouse game of like who's going to do the removal first. Because if they can save their removal in response to you playing Scales, you get 2 for 1. If you use the Scales in response, then it's a 1 for 1. And but it's definitely handy in the mirror match. Third place on Saturday was taken down by Boros Convoke by MTG Nate 04? No, just 4. And if we compare this one to last week, we see that there were no changes to the list at all. And there was also a second place in the second tournament that was taken down by Arcane 1. And that one did have the slightest change, and I'll mention it here in the best of 3 sideboard. So they dropped 1 copy of the Invasion of Gobakon, so they're just running 2. And instead, they're bringing in an additional copy of the Elspeth Smite. Again, I think kind of pointing towards there being a lot of Rakdos Lizards this weekend. And just really quickly, for those who are exploring best of 3 for the first time, you do see War Leaders Call quite a bit more commonly in best of 3 because of there being more Golgari midrange, Azorius Control, and such. The later the game's going, the better War Leaders Call becomes. All right, now for the second tournament on Saturday, and that was taken down. First place was taken down by Orzhov Midrange by Lenny, and it's been a little bit since I talked about what Orzhov Midrange was doing. We have to go all the way back to week 1 since the last time that I covered it. Although I think that Orzhov Midrange is looking particularly good. And we can see that, so they ditched the Doorkeeper Thralls. There was a lot of one-ofs that were kind of being explored in the first week. So we see the Dust Animus gets cut, the Shrouded Shepherd gets cut, Shieldred, the Apocalypse gets cut by 1, and the Harvester of Misery gets cut by 1. And we're bringing in 4 copies of the Caustic Bronco. And notably, yesterday in my Meta Breakers, we were talking about the Shrouded Shepherd in a best of 1 Meta Breaker, and I would guess it's because they took a best of 3 deck in and played it in best of 1, right? Anyway, the Caustic Bronco helps out against more of the control matchups, where the value of being able to get the card draw off of the Caustic Bronco every turn at the cost of life really becomes beneficial. It's a little bit less important in the Rakdos Lizards and Gruul Aggro matchups, right? So this one's a little bit matchup specific here, but Lenny thought it was a good time to bring it in, and it looks like they were correct. And we've also dropped, for the spells, we dropped a single cut down, so going down to 2 here, also pointing a little bit more towards at least the starting list being geared away from aggro. And we dropped 1 Season of the Burrow, and 1 copy of Virtue of Persistence, and brought in the second copy of Legions to Ashes. And this one is particularly good against the token decks, so like what we called the Azorius Convoke in earlier seasons, being able to just wipe anything that's the same copy. We're also bringing in 3 copies of the Liliana of the Veil, another sign for tech card against the control matchups, and maybe a dip in Golgari midrange because of how punishing the Obstinate Baloth is. And then we dropped 1 Fountain port to bring in an additional Swamp. So the best of 3 sideboard, we also see the Doorkeeper Thralls get tossed. That one's anything that has an ETB, so like Domain was quite popular in week 1. Doorkeeper Thrall kind of gives you some sauce against that deck. And Elish Norn, Mother of Machines, similarly prevents the ETBs, can work against Boros Convoke as well. And we dropped the Harvester of Misery from the sideboard as well, and we brought in the Hostile Investigator, also good against control, and Lorn of the Third Path, which gives us a little bit of that artifact hate. And we also dropped 2 copies of the Pest Control, which is for Boros Convoke, or Boros Convoke, and dropped the 1 copy of Kaya and the 2 copies of Liliana of the Veil, because they've been moved to the main. And instead we're bringing in even more stuff for hating on control. So Cruel Claw's Heist, 3 copies of Duress, so we've got a full playset that we can bring in against control, and 2 Pilfers. This one's I thought was a different one. So similar, just more hand hate that we can lean further into. And 2 temporary lockdowns, so we can bring in a full playset of temporary lockdown if we do in fact need to clear the board. All right, 3rd place on Saturday was taken down by Gruul Aggro by WCL. And if we compare this one to week 4, because I kind of had to have a shorter best of 3 review. I want to do a full one this week. But if we compare this to week 4, we can see that they took this in a dramatically different way than we had seen before. So we dropped the Swift Spears, we dropped the Emberheart Challengers, and we dropped the 2 copies of the Questing Druid, which has been around in Gruul Aggro for forever, right? And instead we're leaning into what we see more in best of 1. And so we're leaning into the Heartfire Hero and Cacophony Scamp with the Callous Sellsword. Now, we're not running any black. I get Thran Portal can be black, but I don't think there was any plan to actually play the black. So kind of like the Jund Aggro that we saw in Best of 1. And so we're bringing in the Cacophony Scamps, we're bringing in the Callous Sellsword, we're bringing in an additional copy of the Manifold Mouse, which works nicely with the Heartfire Hero. And we're bringing the Slickshot Show-Ups back up to 4. Previously on week 4, they were dropped down to 2. We're dropping the 4 copies of the Might of the Meek, and the 3 Shocks, and the 3 Demonic Ruckuses, and the 3 Innkeeper's Talent, which is another one that we see in a lot of these Gruul lists, right? But if we're flinging our stuff, we don't care about the, like, inevitability of the Innkeeper's Talent as much, and we would much rather have the big burst spells. So we're also ditching the Witchstalker's Frenzy, and we're leaning into Audacity, which can help increase the power while also giving us a draw. We're bringing in the Giant Growth, which in this deck can be 9 damage to the face. We're bringing in the Mirren Bane Splitter, which it works quite nicely with the Heartfire Hero. If they don't use the interaction the turn that you play it, then it's left behind as a 4/2, and it still deals a lot of damage, right? And then we're bringing in 2 copies of the Snakeskin Veil. So we're running a full playset of the Snakeskin Veil to counteract any of the hate that we're going to have towards this deck. And we're also bringing in a Tyvar's Stand, which similarly, the +X/+X, you can kind of use this as like an instant speed green blaze in this archetype. And then because of the triple damage coming off of the Callous Sellsword, each one of these can end up being 3 damage, right? So you can Tyvar's Stand can hit for a ton in this archetype. And then we also see a different approach in the lands, which I like if we're going to go for this like ultra fast aggression, where we're dropping 5 mountains and 2 of the Rockface Villages, which are just our mana is going to be constricted to other things, right? We brought in a 1 copy of the Restless Ridgeline so that if we do get stopped, we have at least an alternative win condition. And then 4 copies of the Thran Portal. And hey, if the game's over by turn 3, who cares if you're playing Thran Portal, right? So I like this one a lot. And then the sideboard, we didn't get rid of the Questing Druid entirely. We just moved it to the sideboard. And I like this. So there's a couple of things that this deck is doing that, like the Innkeeper's Talent and the Questing Druid are good, but they're matchup specific, right? So in the decks where you're going to want that additional dig, where you're not going to, you know, like maybe you're struggling to actually close out on turn 3 or turn 4 and you need to extend it into turn 4, turn 5, then you can bring in the Questing Druids. Similarly, like grindier matchups where they don't have the enchantment hate, then you've got the Innkeeper's Talent. This is you've also got the Torch the Tower if you're coming up against a fellow aggro deck, being able to specifically Rakdos Lizards comes to mind, but other prowess decks as well. Scorching Shot for problematic blockers, and then Realm and Realmbreaker. I really like this one because Callous Sellsword counts as a permanent. So Wrenn and Realmbreaker, the downtick where you get to put a permanent card from among those milled cards into your hand, can help you specifically find the Callous Sellsword and digs deeper than the Questing Druid does. So it's almost like you can bring in a 6 copies of the Questing Druid if you're really trying to dig and extend a little bit into the mid-range deck. So really cool approach, right? So I guess to keep with the format, so we're bringing in 4 questing druids. We're dropping 2 obliterating bolts. That one's an alternative to Scorching Shot. If you like the exile more, you could try the obliterating bolt. We're dropping the 3 copies of Pick Your Poison, which was like the answer for Domain because it destroys enchantments as well as flyers. So like gets rid of the Archangels, Atraxa, and Up the Beanstalk. And we're dropping a Snakeskin Veil and 2 Tectonic Hazards. So that one was the go wide answer for Azorius and Boros Convoke, and seeing less of that these days. Dropping the 4 copies of the Urbrask's Forge, so all those people bringing in enchantment hate or artifact hate for the Urbrask's Forge won't have anything to hit in this one. And then dropping the Witchstalker's Frenzy to make room for the Innkeeper's Talent, the Torch the Tower, and Realm Breaker. All right, and then Sunday's tournament was Dimir and Orzhov Midrange, like Fridays. And so we see Dimir Midrange by RPA, took down first place on Sunday. And if we compare it to week 4, we see very few changes. We're dropping a Tishana's Tidebinder, which is good against the Planeswalkers in control, shut down Liliana, etc. And we're dropping a Sheoldred the Apocalypse to bring in Anoint with Affliction, which gives us better, like, worse against the Planeswalkers, better against the aggro, right? Better against Rakdos Lizards, and Gix's Command, which gives us a Wrath and also helps up against the Boros Convoke and Azorius Convoke and Rakdos Lizards, being able to give us that Wrath and stabilization off the lifelink. So as far as the best of 3 sideboard, nothing has changed since week 4 on RimF's list, and just sticking with the same strategy there. So we've got like the Sweepers, Harvester of Misery, Malicious Eclipse, Liliana for control, Negate for control, Disdainful Stroke for domain, Duress for control domain, Cut Down for more aggression, Acklezotz for mirror match and early aggression, and then a second copy of Gix's Command if you are up against a aggressive board-centric aggro strategy. All right, second place was taken down Orzhov Midrange by Budatina. And if we compare this one to Lenny's list, we actually see quite a bit of a different approach. So Orzhov Midrange by no means figured out. So this one's not leaning towards the Caustic Bronco. Also ditched the 1 copy of Gix, which goes nicely with the Deep Cavern Bat for getting card draw off of the early evasive threat. And dropping Sheoldred the Apocalypse entirely from the list to bring in 2 copies of Lorn of the Third Path for more hate, I think, specifically against like Urbrask's Forge, and dropping a Go for the Throat and Legions to Ashes and Liliana the Veil to bring in more like Cut Down for the early aggression, Shoot the Sheriff as an alternative to Go for the Throat, being able to hit artifacts, which doesn't have a huge amount to. Flesh Gorger makes its way into some lists, and Go for the Throat then can't kill the Flesh Gorger on turn 3. We've got 2 temporary lockdowns that we're bringing in, which again helps against the early decks, Rakdos Lizards, Convoke decks, and bringing in an additional copy of the Season of the Burrow. I really like this card. I think that like if you're gonna go into a control path, which this one, because it's not doing the Caustic Broncos, feels more controlling. I like the Season of the Burrow edition. And you can bring back like Zoraline and make it indestructible for recurring graveyard shenanigans. And you can use it for double removal, or you can use it for 5 chump blockers. Like I've been very impressed with that card. And Swamp, we're taking out a Swamp and bringing in the second Fountain Port, which kind of reflects it being more control-y than Lenny's list. And as far as the best of 3 sideboard goes, we can see that they teched less heavily against the Boros, or against the control matchups. So we dropped the Hostile Investigators and the Lord of the Third Path. We brought in Beza, the Bounding Spring, so we can bring in the 3rd copy if we're up against aggro. Dropped 1 Duress, so a little bit less hate towards that. Gix's Command Gix's Command we got rid of entirely. And then we also got rid of the 2 Pilfers and the temporary lockdowns. We don't have a full playset. We only have 2 that we can sideboard into. So different tech choices being made in the sideboard for sure. And then Cruel Claw's Heist, we do still see, and I think there's actually even an additional copy to the one Lenny was running. Lenny was running 1, this one's running 2. So we do have some hate for control. Elspeth's Smite for the early aggression, And then we've got one Sunfall as an additional Wrath, and then Kaya, Intangible Slayer, which was one of the planeswalkers that was being explored in week 1. So favoring Kaya here over the additional Liliana of the Veil. And we do still have 2 Lilianas of the Veil in the sideboard. So if we ourselves are up against a match like Domain or something that has a lot of board-centric Wraths, we can bring in the Planeswalkers, which then get around the Wraths and can be problematic for decks like Domain. All right, and the last one to cover here, try to keep my episodes right around 45 minutes, so I think we're close. Is Dimir Midrange by Gasman48. And so if we compare this one to the list that I just talked about by RPA, we can also see they went with a different approach. So we dropped 2 copies of the Spyglass Siren and the Fairy Mastermind. 1 copy there. The Plumecreed Escort, which is able to give a creature hexproof and was being explored by Rem F, is where I saw it first. Also dropping 1 Tishana's Tidebinder, I think also pointing to there being less Planeswalkers and more aggro, where the Tishana's Tidebinder is not great. We're bringing in 2 copies of the Mockingbird, which I really like, because then this one can be whatever little thing you want to copy, right? It doesn't work terribly well with the legendary creatures, but, you know, still being able to kind of up the versatility almost of the like, is it turn 1 or turn 2 when you're playing the Mockingbird? Because keep this in mind that to play the Mockingbird for a 1-drop, you can do X equals 0. And to play Mockingbird as a Fairy Mastermind, X equals 1. So don't overpay for your Mockingbirds. The total value of Mockingbird has to equal the total value of whatever you're copying. I've seen so many people screw that up. We're also bringing in Preacher of the Schism, which is a nice little bit more of like a mid-range threat, really helps against that early aggro. And an additional copy of Shieldred the Apocalypse, which also helps stabilize against the early aggro. Worse a little bit against the board-centric sweepers. And we're dropping the 3 steps ahead, which I really like this. So the 3 steps ahead is worse off in the aggro matchup. So we've seen a lot of aggro coming in last week's meta, and I think that aggro continued into this week's meta. And so 3 steps ahead being a little bit awkward outside of the mid-range and control matchups. And so instead we're just leaning fully into the Phantom Interference as like we'll answer Sunfall with Phantom Interference. Other than that, we're not worrying too much about disrupting our opponent's plays. And so I like that change quite a bit. We also dropped the Anoint with Affliction and the Gix's Command from this list. Gix's Command, again, kind of giving you an answer to some of the aggro strategies. And instead we're, instead we're running 2 copies of Duress in the main. And so this kind of giving you if we're going to drop the 3 steps ahead, then we can use the Duress to get rid of the whatever we would have countered with the 3 steps ahead. So I actually like this substitution. And there's not really a deck in best of 3 that's going to punish the Duress. A lot of the aggro decks are still running quite a few spells. So I don't think Duress is a dead card by any means. It's not a great card to top deck, I'll give you that. But yeah, we're running an additional copy of the Phantom Interference to really negate the to prevent the Sunfall, which is what this deck is all about. This deck is designed to prey on Domain. The more Domain, the happier Dimir Midrange is going to be. And as far as the lands go, we dropped 2 Fable Passages to bring in a Mirrex and 2 additional Swamps. Because we got to have those, you know, Duress is good on turn 1. So if we're going to play the Duress, we're going to want more of that untapped black mana. All right, so for the best of 3 sideboard, compared to RPA's list, we see that they ran an additional copy of the Acklezot's Deepest Betrayal. Again, I really like this one in the mirror match and the aggro decks where like you're wanting to stabilize by turn 5. It's a little bit worse if you're coming up against Sunfall, because then it just gets removed, right? Tishana's Tidebinders in the sideboard instead of in the main. So we're running 2 Tishana's Tidebinders. This one being better against Azorius Control and Golgari Midrange. Anytime Orzhov Midrange. Any deck that's looking to run Planeswalkers, Tishana's Tidebinder I really like. We're dropping a Disdainful Stroke, which means maybe we're not needing to tech so heavily. Against Domain is really what I think I like the Disdainful Strokes for. It also works for counter spells on Sunfall, right? But anyway, the Disdainful Stroke, like, we're already good against Domain, so I can see, like, dropping the Disdainful Stroke there. We dropped the 2 Duress in the sideboard and just brought them into the main. Again, that was just matchup dependent. there's going to be some, like Rakdos Lizards punishes the duress, right? That one's pretty low on spell count. So it really just depends on what you're expecting in the matchup to main deck it or sideboard. Gix's Command we also dropped from the main. So what was this? Gasman just not liking the Gix's Command, which I like it. I like, well, at least one copy of the Gix's Command just because of how versatile the card is. It's personal preference. But then we also dropped the 2 copies of Liliana the Veil. So that's a good one to bring in if you are expecting more control matchups. And brought in an additional copy of Cutdown, help up against like Rakdos Lizards and early aggression. And Kaido Dancing Shadow. And we've seen this one in before rotation. Kaido was an option. It's been too long since I played with Kaido to really remember what the matchups that you want to bring in Kaido. Long ago, I did a best of 3 sideboard guide for Dimir Midrange and talked about Kaido. And it gives you a nice card advantage, right? So you get like evasive damage through, and I don't want to say that it really helps you against control, because it's not necessarily going to help you against control, but I think about like bringing it in on mid-range matchups where you're trying to extend the value a little bit and try to get around a problematic blocker, right? Would love to hear your comments. Feel free to let me know where you like to bring in Kaido. I know it's a sideboard options that's been explored for a long time, so I should know better. But it's been a little bit since we talked about Kaido. So with that, though, that's going to wrap up my best of 1, best of 3 meta review. I hope it finds you well. As I mentioned in my Sunday meta breakers, I will be taking a week off, so you will not hear from me until the Monday before release, right? So you won't hear me until the 23rd, and then I might even skip the 23rd, because why do a meta review if the meta is going to change on the 24th, right? So I'll probably do my, I'm going to try to do my pre-release guide for Duskmourn prior to my trip, try to get that out this Friday. After that, you'll probably hear from me sometime in the first week of Duskmourn to talk about like the early frontrunner. And certainly by the 30th, we'll be talking about week 1 of Duskmourn. So take care, everybody. Welcome to my community if you're new here. All that fun stuff. If you feel like supporting me as a YouTube member, that'd be awesome, because these videos take a gratuitous amount of time. And, any monetary support would be appreciated, but is not expected. And yeah, enjoy Bloomburrow, everybody. I will catch you all around the 30th.